All right, so as he said, my name is Markus Hubbard. I've been doing a cybersecurity for a better part of a decade now. A lot of that time has been spent in the Air Force active duty, part of that doing cybersecurity, a lot of that doing cyber warfare operations. And so what we would do there is look at locations that were either known compromised, potentially compromised, or high value targets. Look at what kind of activity would try to, or what kind of actors would try to get into those networks, and then look at their TTPs, try to generate some IOCs. Once we had that all set up, we'd go out to different locations and actually look on network for that activity. So I've been doing threat hunting with the Air Force and in the private sector for about 5 years now. For the last year or so, I've been working for an MSSP, a managed security services provider, looking at networks for the whole gamut of pipelines, everything from flight for life to banks to industrial control systems. So I've seen a lot of unique configurations and both some really good and some really poor security practices. So looking at kind of where we're standing right now, if you look at the average numbers of days to detect a breach, and this is data from 2019, you had the energy sector really leading the way at 150 days. Entertainment sector is getting slaughtered at 287. But even looking at the energy sector, 150 days from breach to detection, any adversary is going to be able to perform pretty much any actions on objectives that they'd want to at that point. So a little bit more information. It's definitely getting better, but still a lot of room to improvement. So FireEye is reporting that most compromises, they're getting notifications if it's internal in about a month, and if it's coming from external sources like the FBI, DOD, anything like that, you're going to be getting well over 3 months on average. So again, lots of time on target for your adversaries to be able to do whatever they're looking to do. So looking at the attacker advantages right now, the main ones that I really want to point out in here are they have as much time to configure and prepare as they want and as they need. There's no hard deadlines for attackers to be able to, that they have to have an attack done by most of the time. Also, you're looking at the CIA triad, which in most organizations, you're going to be focusing primarily on getting that availability, getting that production server out there making the money. Next one is lack of C-suite buy-in. The C-suite in general is looking at security as a cost center, not as revenue protection. And so when you look at it in that frame, then they want to spend as little as possible. And then the final attacker advantage is everyone's favorite users. No matter how much you train them, no matter how well advised they are, some users are still going to make that mistake of clicking on that link that they shouldn't, opening that attachment that they shouldn't. So looking at the defender advantages, so logging is becoming more widespread, which is really absolutely key to most security operations. A lot of the off-the-shelf malware is getting flagged because those IPS signatures, IDS signatures are getting developed much more rapidly now. And then a lot of people are taking advantage of the bug bounty programs and identifying those attack methodologies on the defensive side rather than getting it into the hands of the attackers first. And a lot of organizations are beginning to really take their cybersecurity more seriously. You look at the Target breaches, the Sony breaches, Maersk, which was devastating to the organization. They're starting to realize that if they don't spend money in security, they're going to be spending what they would have spent tenfold on remediation. So a lot of what I'm going to be looking at is what I call detection point mapping. And so that's where you're taking a basic view of your network and identifying where different attack methodologies, where different signatures would actually get detected in that network. What this allows you to do is really go out and identify where are your weak points, where would attacks be able to get through, and then if those attacks would get through, where are you going to be able to go and make modifications to your detection mechanisms to all your different systems to be able to really get that threat detected in the future. A lot of those methodologies for finding those threats, you're going to be using your cyber tabletops, a lot of threat modeling, pen testing, and then unfortunately it does happen, you're going to have incident reconstructions as well. So this is the basic map that I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. Very basic. It doesn't need to be very complex and fully engaged. So you got your cloud services, your AWS, Azure, you got your VPN users, which we all have plenty of right now. And then you've got on the bottom row your DMZ, so that's going to be your VPN concentrator, your web services. You've got your critical services, so your domain controllers, your DNS, your exchange gateways. Next box over is your production servers, so that's going to be SQL servers, whatever else you're running in the back end. And then the bottom right side is primarily your user land. So you got HR, finance. The reason I wanted to spread those out is because those tend to have a lot of high value information. You also have your main production where most of your users are going to be, and then hopefully you have your development environment. Then all that's tied together through the firewall and router and IPS. I know that most of the time you're going to have multiple routers, multiple firewalls, but for simplicity's sake, we can dump it down to just this. So looking at where do we go from where we are right now. So the biggest thing that I'm going to focus on is logging. If you don't have logging, you cannot do incident reconstruction. You cannot do effective pen testing because you won't be able to trace how they got to what they got to. So next one is engaging the users. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one here in just a minute. We're going to talk about retaking the information advantage from the attackers, and then encouraging creativity and new lines of thinking. So looking at the basics. So when you're setting up your user profiles, please, please, please enforce the principle of least privilege. And not just that, alert on when somebody tries to go beyond their normal privilege levels. And you see the gear next to that, that's going to be something you'll see repeatedly through this, where you're able to go and automate a lot of those, not just alerts, but responses to those alerts. So next basic one is please use multi-factor authentication. There's so many tools out there now that you guys can use where it'll get you past that point of just using username and passwords, because the days of just username and passwords is over. Next section is implementing your patches quickly. We've all heard the expression that patch Tuesday leads to hack Wednesday. It is so true. Some dates or some metrics here, 60% of the 2019 breaches, there was already a patch available. Now, some of those are going to be within a week or 2 weeks of that patch being released, but the vast majority of those are likely going to be situations where the patch was released 4, 5, 6 months ago, a year ago, and they're still getting exploited on those old patches. Engaging the user. Please don't just send out a once a year, hey, it's cybersecurity month, this is what you should be doing email or PowerPoint. The users will look at it, they might open the PowerPoint, and then 2 weeks later, they don't remember anything that they did. Where I've seen a lot of success is making very actively engaging user content, where you're going to a conference, your annual conference, something like that, and having real scenarios put in front of the users. One of my favorite ones is having them spot the phishing emails and run the gamut. Start from the very basic emails where this is obviously bad to us, up to very well-crafted emails that even we would have a hard time identifying, because most of your malware coming into the network is going to come through email. The next one that I've seen success with is doing operational security testing or situations with users, where you're giving each team a bit of information and then seeing how much of that information can be pulled together by somebody on the outside to get information that they really shouldn't have in the first place. And then my personal favorite is showing examples of how quickly malware can can go through a network. One example that I've seen of this is somebody who had set up a VM environment where they had, I want to say 16 VMs running, and they had 8 different malwares that were released in that virtual network. And then whenever a system would get compromised with more than 4 different types of malware, it would just reset it back to the snapshot, and you can just watch it just jump all across the entire network. One of the biggest things that we can do for these users is encourage users to report things that are unusual, and even more importantly, reward them when they do. If they report something as phishing and they don't get any response or any notification that what they did was important, they're going to stop doing it. A big part of that is teaching them what information they need to be reporting and what unusual activity they should be looking out for. And then ultimately it comes down to them feeling like they are an important part of the organization and the security team. If they don't feel like what they are doing has any impact, they're going to stop doing it. So looking at the user space, it covers a lot of your attack surface. So you're going to be getting notifications. You're not going to get all users to report on that, obviously, but you're going to be getting notifications from HR, from production, from your VPN users. So that's a very key point of where you can get those initial pivot points where you can launch your defensive actions from. So one of the big things that I like to focus on is changing the information paradigm. So right now, when an attacker gets into 99% of the networks, they can trust all the information that they see in that environment. So one of the things that I like to advocate for is changing things up a little bit. In my opinion, the main 3 goals of internal defenses should obviously be: 1, to prevent and identify unauthorized activity. 2 is slowing down the attacker, really making them question, is this information that I'm seeing legitimate, or sending them information that doesn't jive with what the tools are expecting. And that's really that's number 3, is getting that confusing information out there so that the automated tools aren't going to be giving them the responses they expect. So something I strongly advocate for, and I've had problems with in the past, is organizations who are just using the default settings. Right now, a lot of organizations are going to have RDP open to the world. If you can geo-block it, great. But definitely try to migrate it to an ephemeral port, because if you have an attacker who's doing port scanning and they get up to port 10,000, you should have some defenses already that are going to identify that. One of my favorite ones to do is changing the responses used for OS fingerprinting. If you change your GTL and it doesn't match a Windows or a Linux system, then that OS fingerprinting is not going to be nearly as successful. And absolutely make sure that your organization has replaced all the factory default passwords with something that with whatever you guys want it to be. I cannot tell you how many incidents I've seen where organizations, the router had the default configuration or the DNS server had the default configuration. And so attackers were able to find it and then immediately just get straight in. The other side of that is don't give away information for free. For host names, don't have it be something that gives your IT team value. Like if it's a Windows system, have an L at a specific location. If it's Windows 10, have that in there. But don't put it in such a way that an attacker can see, oh, obviously I am in this section of the network. Obviously I can, like your file server, don't just make it FS. Have something in there where it's going to be a bit more challenging for the attackers to decipher, so they're not getting that easy information. Next one is looking at the admin schema. I've seen some very creative ones where all the admins have the same username essentially, but with an extra character at the end. I've seen some where it's the other end of the spectrum, where admins are literally your first.last_admin. That for an attacker gives them a very easy way to target which accounts they're going to try to password crack first. And then another just side note on that is make sure your admins aren't admins for the entire site unless they need to be. If you have a web admin, they don't need to be having DC privileges, stuff like that. So the more you can enforce that principle of least privilege, the more difficult it's going to be for attackers to get whatever their final goal is. One of my favorite ones as well is looking at the About Us and Contact Us pages. So for me, if I'm doing open source intelligence on somebody, that's one of the first places that I hit. A lot of times you will be able to get your email schema out of that. Mix it up. If it's listed on your Contact Us page, I recommend not having that match your email schema internal to the organization. So that way, if some attacker from another country that's never actually interacted with anybody from your organization tries to send an email, so in this example from xyz.com, when your actual email domain is xyzsolutions.com, you now know that that can just get automatically dropped because nobody would ever actually be sending or spoofing an email, or if they were sending it from xyz.com, you know it's going to be spoofed. And so it's not legitimate. Automatically drop it, block the IP. So again, on the detection point, so you'd be getting that at your email exchange server. And then really getting into the meat of this is we're looking at setting the traps throughout the network so that whenever attackers do step on one of those traps, now you have your pivot point to identify how they got in, what they're doing, and how to stop them. So fake DNS entries can be a lot of fun. So I've seen very good success with these especially in the test and the dev environments. Setting up fake DCs where as soon as somebody tries to go to that system, then you know that it's bad. And again, another place where you can set it up to automatically block their IP. So good targets for those are usually DCs, Exchange servers, database servers, especially SQL servers are always very fun, and people always try to get to those because a lot of times in that dev environment or that test environment, those aren't going to be hardened as well as they're going to be on the actual production system. So looking at your detection point map, so you got a lot of coverage, you get some coverage in the cloud and the DMZ, your critical services, and especially in that dev environment. Expanding web structures is one that can be frustrating when people are using a lot of automated tools. So what this does is every time that somebody tries to go to, in your web server, tries to go to a subfolder, it generates new additional subfolders below that. So that way, if somebody is trying to just spider across your entire web structure, it's gonna just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And then with that, you can easily set those up so that when it reaches a certain depth, it'll send an alert, or you can take that automated action. So that's going to be effective again wherever you have your web servers, most likely in the DMZ, possibly in the cloud, and then also in your dev environment. ROBOTS.TXT is another fun place to play with them a little bit. It's very similar to DNS, where if you're not familiar with ROBOTS.TXT, it's pretty much telling search engines, hey, these subsections are off limits. So attackers will usually look at that robots.txt and be like, hey, what fun stuff can I play with and try to get into that they don't want the search engines to look at? So throw a couple entries in there for systems that don't actually exist, or you have set up as a honeypot. So again, you're going to be getting that a lot in the DMZ, in the cloud environment, and in your dev environment. Honey ports is part of the Honey suite, and I'll be talking about the Honey suite for the next little bit, where what you can do is, depending on which OS you're running, there's lots of ways to do it, but you're setting up a port that's open but doesn't actually connect to anything. And so PowerShell is a very easy way to do this. An example was written by PowderKeg, where you're able to set it up, choose what ports you want it to look for, and then log that connection and send that just the notice of that connection across the network, which can then be picked up by your IDS, your IPS, and then if you want, you can take automated actions again on that. So an example of what you can do using Netcat if you're on a Linux system, again, very easily expanded to be able to send those strings out across the network, really get those people looking at stuff that isn't even really there but would look enticing to them. And another important aspect of all this is very effective against both outside attackers and insider threats. Looking at those people who are just kind of poking around when they shouldn't be. So looking at using the honey ports, I recommend throwing those on your production servers occasionally. If you have a web server, go ahead and throw a SQL port on there. Finance, dev, and production, a lot of times you'll get those interesting hits on there. And a lot of times those will get hit by the default scanners as well. If somebody's using Nmap or something like that, it's still going to try to connect to that port, which is then going to get logged, and now you can take your automated action or pivot off it however you see fit. A big one that's going on right now in today's world, I recommend setting up a honey concentrator. Have a fakes. So you should have moved your VPN services off of the default ports. Set up a honey concentrator where you're emulating a legitimate concentrator on that default port, because you know that none of your users are going to be set up to connect to that, so no malicious or no legitimate traffic should be connecting to that. So again, that's going to be getting you in the DMZ. Honey SQL, one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen with using honey SQL in the past is a lot of times users will go and set up all of these on a single box. In reality, you're not going to have more than one instance, possibly two instances on a box. So setting up more than one on a box is just going to send up some warning flags that, hey, something with this doesn't look right. And again, that gets back to the make it enticing but not too enticing situation. So there are most likely you're going to be getting that detection in the cloud and in your critical services. Sometimes you'll get that in your production servers as well. You just want to make sure that all that is well documented. Honey accounts. So I've seen this employed both very successfully and very poorly in the past. The ones that I've seen that have been successful, they actually have some scripted activity on there. Because if I'm an attacker and I'm looking at when the last time a user account was used, if it wasn't used in the last 3 years, then I know that something's probably not right with that one. So try to get that scripted activity set up in there so that it is getting regularly logged into during normal business hours and performing functions that would be normal for a business. So opening Word, opening Excel, opening emails, stuff like that. So any alert or any login attempts outside of when you have your scripted login times should definitely be alerted on. And then this gives you an interesting chance where you can either immediately boot them out of the network or look at that intelligence gain loss. What tools might they drop on that system that now you can add to your searches for on all the other systems, or add to your app blacklist or something like that. And then finally, it's very important to document all these, especially because these are likely going to be running on systems for years. You're going to have turnover, you're going to have personnel change out or switch to new locations, stuff like that. So you want to make sure to have a document listing all those accounts and what the scripts are doing. The other aspect of that is also legal if your organization should choose to go that way. If you identify somebody doing malicious activity in your network and you want to pursue the legal route, if you don't have a documented list of all the scripts that are on there and all the honey accounts, then it would be very easy for their defensive team to come in and say, well, you don't even know what's supposed to be running on there, so how do you know it was our activity that was doing that and not your scripts? So a lot of commercial options out there for it. CANARY is a good one. DShield honeypot is is one that I've seen used in the past that did fairly well. Honey Workstations is one that I love to pair with those honeypot accounts. And so what you're doing is you can be either a virtual system or a physical system. I'd say I recommend matching it to your actual configuration, because if you have all physical workstations and then all of a sudden this one is virtual, that could very easily tip off an attacker to say, hey, something is unusual here. Maybe I shouldn't touch this system. Make sure your OS and patching match the standard business operations. Again, if you have a system where it's running 8, 9, 10 patches before or late compared to all the other workstations, that can tip an attacker off that, hey, why is there a vulnerability on this one system and not on any of the others? The other side is software. If there's software that's just deployed across your entire environment, make sure that you have that same software on these Honey workstations. And just like with the users, make sure that you are documenting all your Honey workstations and any scripts that you have set up to run on there. So detection points for all the Honey users and Honey workstations, you're going to be looking entirely in the user land for that. You could set up some Honey servers and stuff in as well in your critical services and your production services, but that tends to get a little messy sometimes. You definitely can do it. If you do it, I just say be careful and make sure it's very well documented. Canary documents is great if you are worried about data exfiltration. So a couple ways you can do this. The one that I like the most is just embedding a 1 pixel by 1 pixel image into it that calls back where the image is hosted on your web server. So knowing that legitimately nobody would ever be going to that image, anytime you see that, you're pretty sure it's going to be malicious. The other side of that is if somebody is opening that document that has no legitimate reason to ever be open for business operations, if it's open on the inside, you know that you have somebody poking around that shouldn't be, so you get to go have a fun conversation. If it's somebody on the outside, then you know that you've had data exfiltration. So looking at your detection point, so it's going to be all of user land for that internal side, and then knowing that something was exfiltrated and opened outside in the internet. So another way you can look about doing this one is the native group policy settings for attempts to access folders and files in Windows. It'll utilize event ID 4663, so it's very easy to pick on an alert on the SIEM, and then also very easy to take actions on that. The best case that I've seen is they had this set up, and any account that would access that and trip 4663 was automatically disabled. So that way, if it's a legitimate user just messing around looking at stuff they normally wouldn't, then you can go have that conversation with them. If it's an attacker, now they've lost that first account, and now you can trace back and use that pivot point to identify how they got in, what else is compromised. So on that side, I'd recommend using that on your cloud environment, your critical services, and your production servers, getting those enticing folders out there like payroll and stuff like that, that even though it's not your actual storage location for it, is going to look very enticing for those attackers. File integrity monitoring is a great tool that I recommend for breach detection. So you want to look at, and it can be multiple of these, but you want files that don't change very often, files that are critical to business operations, so your proprietary or confidential information, any information that you'd want to know about if it was changed without authorization. So you're not going to be able to do this, or it's not feasible to do this on files just all over the place. You want to really target what you're looking at with this file integrity monitoring. And then you also want to look at files that are critical to network operations. So your router and switch configs, and especially the backups, because when I put on my red hat, I love to go for backups and then just wait for them to have to pull that backup in. IPS signatures is definitely something that I recommend setting up, because I've seen it in the past where people have tried to get into firewalls and modify that IPS or IDS signature so that then it's not actually alerting on the attack method that they're going to use. They weren't successful in my cases, luckily, but it's definitely something I've seen and wouldn't be surprised to see again. So a number of options out there. Tripwire is a very good one. Tanium is a good one, but tends to be a little bit resource intensive. And then almost everybody's still using Cisco, so I strongly recommend the Cisco iOS Software Integrity Assurance Suite. There are a couple other ways to do it where if you're not as worried about what changes were made and you just want to revert it back to a known good, I've seen this used a lot in Capture the Flag and Castle versus Castle. It's very frustrating and to other teams when they're going against something like this, where I've seen people literally throw a laptop in a room when we were doing a Castle versus Castle because we had set up a script where every 30 seconds it would check the hash. If the hash didn't match our flag, it would just pipe our flag right back into the file. So that can be incredibly frustrating or humorous depending on which side you're on. So for file integrity monitoring, you're looking at a pretty good coverage on this one. You definitely want to hit up your HR and finance sides, HR especially because if that HIPAA information gets out, if that personally identifiable information, that PII gets out, that can have huge cost ramifications. DMZ, you'd want to look at your web server configs, looking at if somebody's able to get into those and inject some custom code into like your indexed files, stuff like that. It can cause a lot of havoc in there. Critical services, especially looking at your DCs, stuff like that. Production servers, just really everywhere that you have that critical business information or information that's needed for your network to operate the way it should be. Creativity in the field. All right, so this is where I really want to encourage you guys to go out and come up with creative, innovative ideas on how to throw the attackers off. Some of the stuff that I'm working on right now is I'm working on a custom plugin for browsers where you add a custom header to any packet coming out of that browser, and then at the VPN proxy or the SSL proxy, that'll get stripped off. The benefit of that is the only stuff that should usually be using 443 is browsers. So if you have an attacker inside your network who's using everybody's favorite 443 to exfil or to do C2 or anything like that, they're not going to have that custom header. Now I can alert on that and take the necessary actions. Another one that I've looked at doing in the past that would be good for a small organization, but probably very hard to manage for a large organization, is having a set of scripts on the user's desktop where every morning when they come in, they see a number on the wall, and that's the number of the script that they run. So when the user logs in, if they don't run that correct script within 5 minutes of connecting to the network, their account gets disabled and their systems get isolated because it's assumed compromised. One that I look forward to using in the future and really finding a way to make it functional is tying in Active Directory with the badge system. So if the badge hasn't been swiped to come into the building, then that account is not able to get logged into. Obviously, you'd have systems set up for VPN and stuff like that, but utilizing some of the other security software that you have outside of the traditional IT realm and really getting that involved in there as well. So talking about the automatic responses. So a couple of different ways you can go about this one. You can just go straight for the kill and do those IP blocks. One that I'm a big advocate of is getting more intensive logging going on, because a lot of times you're not logging everything that's going on for systems or anything like that. But if you start having those potential indicators of compromise or those traps have been triggered, now you can turn on more logging and really get the full picture of what's going on that system or in that environment. Something to play with is if certain traps or triggers are fired, you can look at doing an automatic password change, and then the user has to come and validate activity before they get to reset that password to something that they know. And then the last one that I've seen used a couple times is some Active Directory group changes, where depending on the trap or trigger that fires, they start losing permissions. And now they can't get to the file server. Now they can't get to those other systems until that activity is validated. I strongly recommend that you guys leverage your SIEM. There's a lot of activity out there that can be easily identified and reacted to that people just aren't looking for right now. Very simple stuff like RDP to or from a country that you guys don't do business with. Again, this goes back to locking down RDP as well with geo-blocking if you can. Where an example of this is one of the organizations that I had, they had RDP open to the world, and we were getting alerts constantly for 25 login attempts within 2 minutes, which obviously is malicious. When we were able to implement that, the geo-blocking, and really tailor that down, we went from about 16 alerts a day down to about 3 a week. So much more manageable and much easier to utilize. Make sure you're looking at your DNS requests. If you have something going to a known bad site, have an alert that gets thrown into your SIEM. Something that we don't have a lot of time for most of the time, but if just because of the normal workload that we're under, is looking for that frequency of least occurrence. So looking for if somebody's coming inbound to a port that's not common, and they only do it once. Yes, it's only once, but it could be a sign of more advanced attackers trying to really target your environment rather than just looking for script kiddies that are just blasting it with everything. A very strong one that I recommend looking for is looking at that in processes. So if you have a process that's only running on 1 or 2 systems and you have 1,000 workstations, that's very unique, and that's something that I would definitely pay attention to. Another thing that you want to look at is ingesting those system metrics. So if you have high workstation CPU or GPU usage after hours, that could absolutely be a sign that you have a crypto miner installed on there. Whether that's really a topic of concern for your organization at that point is another story, but definitely something you can pay attention to, because that can also be a very good sign that something in that workstation, in that server, is potentially getting ready to fail. So a couple architecture recommendations is, again, you please use multi-factor authentication. It is so easy to implement now. There's no good reason not to be doing it. So I strongly recommend setting up VPN access where it's allowed through an AD group, where if somebody is planning travel, cool, we'll add you to the AD group during that time. Hey, you're going out on an emergency business trip, we'll add you to the AD group real quick. Really easy to maintain, but very effective at minimizing the attack surface coming from your VPN. I think in the next 5 years, pretty much everybody is going to need to have some SSL TLS decryption on a web proxy, because it's so pervasive, especially when you look at new stuff coming out like DNS over HTTPS. Yeah, you can disable it at the enterprise level now, but what if they decide to change that in the future? Now you're losing all of your DNS requests if you don't have that proxy engaged there. And also, it's such a common attack vector and tool used by attackers. You need to be decrypting all your SSL and TLS to see what's going on inside of that encrypted traffic. Strongly recommend using IPSs over IDSs. Get that automatic reaction in there. Yes, you don't want to set it up for everything to automatically drop, but you can really tailor that in and get those easy kills out of the way, that low-hanging fruit. And then please, for the love of God, if you are working on an ICS, keep it as separated as you can. If you need monitoring, that's totally understandable. Use those one-way taps or diodes to get that data out, but without any ability to get user commands set into it from unauthorized locations. So looking at your keys to success, logging. If you don't have logs, you don't know what's going on in your environment. Something that has had mixed reviews is putting a monetary attack to the value that you stopped. Looking at it from the perspective of, hey, we had 6 ransomware attacks this month that were all stopped. Each one of those could have done $250,000 worth of damage to the organization and stop production for a week. Really look at your environment as a battlefield where you control so much of this environment and you can tailor it to whatever you guys want. Really be creative and lay those traps and triggers out as often as you can. A lot of them are very cheap to implement. And the other flip side of that is make sure you're documenting what's going on. Whenever you have a new trip or trigger go out, make sure you're looking at what is our response to this going to be. How much do we trust this alert, and really getting a good documentation on all of the different steps in that response process. Really empower your security team to be creative, to come up with new ideas. There are so many different ways that we can slow down and confuse these attackers. We just have to enable our security teams to be able to go out and look at that and say, hey, this is something unusual, or this is a way that we could get attacked. How could we detect on this? How can we prevent it? And lastly, I want to make sure that everybody is trying to use defense in depth, because there is or will be a way that every single defensive countermeasure can be beaten. It might not happen now, but it's likely going to happen in the near future. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Awesome. So it looks like we do have a few questions. The first one comes from @Superfish. In regards to slowing down the attacker, what's the best way to keep notes, tracking documentation for any honeypots or accounts within the enterprise?
So most of the time what I've seen is setting up like OneNote, stuff like that, stuff that can be collaboratively updated. Yeah, that's the primary one that I've seen, but I wouldn't be surprised to see people just using Word docs. Adding in those network diagrams would be very helpful.
For sure, makes sense. I can definitely say I also love OneNote. It's just super easy to use. It's a pain in the butt getting people to use anything else, it seems. Second question from Prince of Thieves. What's the difference between honeynets and cyber deception systems?
So cyber detection systems, I think, would include honeynets, but it would also reach out beyond that. So I think that honeynets would be included in one, but the other is much more overarching, if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. Another question from Honey Badger. How and do you integrate tabletops into all this?
So tabletops, I think, are drastically undervalued. I've had a lot of really good experiences of going to organizations that I was supporting and sitting down with a team of 4 or 5, 6 people and saying, okay, this is the attack that we're going to emulate right now. How would this be alerted on? How do we stop this in the future? And then when you're able to get them to really work through that whole process, it can be very effective. I also like using those for incident response scenarios where you're really testing your incident response plan, because I've seen lots of scenarios where we're working through our incident response plan and somebody says, hey, I'm responsible for this, but I don't know how to do that. Or, hey, I need this document, but nobody has been tasked to give it to me. And so really getting those plans tested is a great use of cyber tabletops, which I very strongly advocate for.
Awesome. All right. Last but not least, do you have any recommendations for SSL decryption solutions for people to go out and put into their own environments?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't right now. I haven't really looked into that much myself. I mean, I've definitely seen stuff like Blue Coat and stuff like that used a lot in different environments, but with Blue Coat being bought by Chinese companies, that's kind of changing. But that is definitely, link up with me offline, and I'll definitely find some for you and send them over your way.